Thank you, Zach, and good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone that can join us today in this very interesting, we hope, conversation. So, as you all know, it's not to pray for anyone. The financing gap for the SDGs will remain staggering. We just released this week the latest OECD Global Outlook on Financing for Development, and there you'll find the latest data on the fact that the estimated trillions needed to achieve the SDGs keeps increasing and accumulating every year. Yet the fact is that development budgets are under pressure, and also private capital has remained cautious regarding engaging in development processes as a key investor on it. So in this context, we believe the challenge is not just about mobilizing more resources, which is needed absolutely, and the FFD4 conversation is going to be very important for that, but also to ensure that the dollars delivered achieve the greatest impact, that we can uh, really achieve the maximum impact with every source of financing put in the table. So that requires shift. This is where we think outcomes-based financing comes in, offers promise. We call it OBF for short in this conversation. It's these kind of approaches that shift the focus from inputs to results, and that can help align financing with SDGs, ensure that resources translate in measurable improvements in people's lives, and also that contribute to the sustainability of the planet. So I think a conceptual point is important to have a common language. And here at the OECD, we use the OBF, outcome financing, more as an umbrella term that includes a variety of approaches, some of them very distinct, but all of them have in common that they link funding to specific and measurable outcomes, rather to, as traditionally is done, to activities or processes or some very concrete outputs. Uh, we have seen that this family of tools has grown over the years. There you count like things like social and development impact bonds, outcomes funds, performance-based contracts, etc. And we have seen also that they tend to incentivize innovation, strengthen accountability, and create a cultural learning around the areas in which they operate. So it is not surprising that over the last 15 years, OBF has gained traction across sectors and geographies, generating valuable evidence about when and how it can work best. And so far, we are estimating that over or close to 100 billion in development finance has been channeled through OBF type of support over the last decade. So because it's important to accumulate that evidence base, as Zach was mentioning in the opening remarks, uh, we have to come with academics, with practitioners, with evaluators that can help us grow this corpus of evidence of how effectively use OBF for better service delivery. So uh, why is that OBF should play, we think, an important role in the conversation in FFD4, but also in the broader goal that we all have of better delivering on the SDGs. The SDGs were an attempt to emphasize the importance of looking at the outputs and outcomes to the results. And that's where the effectiveness angle of the SDGs brings to the conversation about financing for development, which rightly so, is much more focused normally on mobilization of funds. OBF can help ensure that financing is not just mobilized at the scale, but also more efficiently, more accountable, and more impactful. At least that's the promise and the theory of change we have in these initiatives that many actors have been promoting over the last 15 years. For international development cooperation, OBF offers new avenues to align also different actors. Governments take the lead in many countries in leading OBF. Development partners can come in, investors and implementers to really create ecosystems that are focused in achieving shared outcomes. And that's kind of the promise and positive evolution of the development effectiveness agenda that we see in introducing OBF approaches to development cooperation. Also more in the space of private business and finance, it also provides the gap, the bridge that connects social impact with financial returns, that unlocks capital for critical sectors like education, health, and employment, and it's particularly also youth employment, which is quite important in many developing countries as a national priority. So why is the OECD engaged in this process and its members? Well, we recognize the growing interest and evolving evidence base on OBF, and we have launched last year this global stock taking to understand better what works in OBF and why. And for that, we are very happy to be in conversation with leading academics and experts and knowledge partners that have been working on this for a decade or more, and that can provide a good sense of what the trends are, what's the lessons learned, etc. We are collaborating also with partners across the globe, including with many of you here today, to develop practical guidance for policymakers, for practitioners, for investors. Our aim is not to advocate for OBF as the solution for all contexts. And no, we are far from that. But to equip decision makers with the skills to assess when and how OBF can enhance the effectiveness and impact of development finance, to find when it's this tooling within or this set of tools within the broader toolkit can be used for advancing national policies and social outcomes in different country contexts. So just finishing, why this session today? I'm very happy that we're having this conversation now in the lead to Seville in FFD4 in June. This session is a critical step towards building a more coherent narrative also around OBF. Because we have an evidence base which is growing, we should ensure that those lessons are captured, shared, understood, are applied in practice. And that's kind of the collaboration we're trying to establish with all the actors involved in this process. This common understanding, we think, can help us mainstream the use of OBF, where it can add more value and avoid this application when conditions are not conducive to success. So that we hope is our value add to this conversation going forward. And maybe it takes the form of principles to use OBF or guidance or both that in any case will co-create with all the actors that are involved in this process. So just concluding, we hope that this conversation with the leading thinkers, excellent panel we have today on what the evidence says will spark ideas, questions, collaborations going forward that will feed into the effective process. We have high stakes and the time is short from here to June, but we hope that we can really consolidate this evidence and make everybody focus much more on outcomes, and that we can make everybody dollar count. Please, thank you. And let me give the floor now to our esteemed moderator for the panel, Jemima Hopkinson, who is leading the work on innovative financing for development at the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. Jemima, please, you have the floor.
Thanks, Alejandro, and hi, everyone, and thank you for joining today. As Alejandro said, I work in the FCDO's Impact Investment team, where I lead our work on outcomes-based financing. Now, as an organization, we've been interested in this way of delivering for over 10 years, and we're continuing to drive outcomes-based approaches, both within our own organization, but also amongst the wider development community. And that includes supporting the work of the Outcomes Finance Alliance and the recent work that Alejandro was explaining that the OECD is undertaking to really understand outcomes-based approaches and where they can be most effective. So I'm very excited to welcome and introduce our panel today. We have Emily Gustafson-Wright, who's a senior fellow at the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution. Emily is a global expert on innovative financing mechanisms, including a whole range: payment by results, public-private partnerships, impact investing. And she is particularly a thought leader in the field of social and development impact bonds, on which she is published extensively. We also have Mara Iroldi, who's the academic co-director of the Government Outcomes Lab, which is based at the University of Oxford's Blavatnik School of Government. Mara leads a team of both research and policy engagement specialists who are all focused on innovative public sector contracting and how to construct effective cross-sector partnerships to achieve better social outcomes. And Mara comes with 2 decades experience of connecting academic insights to decision makers in order to achieve social impact. And we also have Ozel Beleli, who's an expert on early childhood development and basic education policy. And she has over 15 years experience in sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East and Southeast Asia, working on this topic. Ozel is currently the head of learning and engagement at the Education Outcomes Fund, which has been a front runner in applying the Outcomes Fund approach in education and training. So we'll start by giving the floor to each of our speakers in turn to really set the scene And I'll pass to Emily first. Emily, we'd love to hear an overview of the landscape from your perspective. Why are researchers and academics interested in OBF? What questions are they interested in? And why does this all matter?
Thanks so much, Jemima. Yeah, so I have been researching outcomes-based financing for about a decade. In particular, I have been focusing on one form of outcomes-based financing, social and development impact bonds and outcomes funds, which bring impact investors to provide the risk capital for a project with the promise of a return if agreed upon outcomes are achieved. So as a researcher at a policy think tank, if you go to the next slide, thanks. As a researcher at a policy think tank, I was focused on the barriers to better developmental learning and health outcomes of children. And I was really curious when I heard about impact bonds, again, about a decade ago, about the potential for this relatively new financing mechanism at the time to improve outcomes. So this slide here highlights just a few of the shocking statistics related to children and youth, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. What I noticed when I began to conduct my research was that there was essentially nobody writing about this form of innovative financing that didn't have skin in the game. So like there were white papers and other great literature that had been written, but most had been produced by intermediaries or other stakeholders that were also promoting the mechanism. And so this was about 4 years in. So yeah, about 2014 is when I started. And I noticed that there really was sort of a gap for that needed to be filled of sort of independent and objective observer voice in this space. And so in 2015, we published sort of the seminal report on impact bonds, which looked at the potential and limitations of impact bonds, lessons from the first 5 years. So we are coming up on the 10-year anniversary of that. And in this report, we put forth what we call the 10 common claims. And I'm sure many of you, I see many friends and colleagues on this call, are very familiar with these. But we continue to come back to these because I think it's good to keep asking the question, what do we know so far? And you know, are these still sort of the relevant claims? Are there others, et cetera? So these are the claims that we identified in this sort of gray literature and that we have been sort of testing over the past decade. So the claims were that impact bonds shift the focus to outcomes, build a culture of monitoring and evaluation by driving performance management, while at the same time incentivizing collaboration and investing in preventive interventions. They were also said to reduce risk for government, crowd in additional private funding, and support experimental interventions. And that they could help to achieve scale and sustain impact. First of all, let me just note that this is a very big ask of one financing mechanism. But what have we observed over the past decade? So I would say that the most salient of the claims are the first three. So from our research and the research of many others, it does appear that impact bonds have indeed succeeded in shifting the focus to outcomes. Not only for the projects in which these impact bonds were used, but also, I think, more broadly in the development landscape. So a shift from inputs to outcomes, but also even in traditional results-based financing, which tended to use outputs as the results measure, a shift farther to the right in the results chain. So this really means a focus on program effectiveness, which Alejandro noted at the beginning, is such a crucial issue in terms of financing for development. Relatedly, strengthening capacity around performance management has also been a major story coming out of the space, as has been the incentivization of collaboration across different types of actors. Where the evidence has been less strong is if they do in fact reduce the risk for government. So this is really sort of a rigor question. So only for the cases where outcomes were not achieved can we say so for sure. That they resulted in little to no financial, reputational, non-disbursement risk. However, for those that have achieved outcomes, we don't know if we would have achieved those outcomes in the absence of the impact bond. And there's a bit of a debate about the supporting experimental interventions claim. Some argue that they're ideal for doing so. Others argue that they're not. We've seen a little bit of both. And there can be a little bit of tension between this and the claim that's related to scale, achieving scale. And I think we'll also come back to this in the discussion. So some have been used to test a new way of service delivery, and others have been used to scale a tested way of tested type of intervention, but at scale. At the end of the day, it depends a little bit on the risk appetite of the investors and potentially the outcome funders as well. And then I would add two new claims to this after my observation of the market over the past decade. I think there are two really interesting pieces. One is that we've seen that they are able to support small service providers in some cases who wouldn't otherwise have been able to enter the market. And this often happens through multiple service providers being part of a project. And you'll hear from Osel about the Education Outcomes Fund. And I think this is something really interesting, and also thinking about sort of potentially a bigger bang for the buck with a consortia of different service providers working to contribute in different ways in a particular sector. And the next slide, I'll just give a quick run through of what we've seen in terms of the distribution of impact bonds across the sectors. So in the left-hand graph, you can see the distribution across sectors of the entire market, so the entire world. And in the right-hand graph, you can see just low and middle income countries. And so we can see that there's a little bit of a difference. In low and middle income countries, we see that education and health are the two largest sectors, followed by employment. And then finally, in the next slide, what do we know about outcome achievement and repayment? A few years ago, we published a report looking at measuring the success of impact bonds across 5 dimensions. And one of those dimensions is the achievement of outcomes and repayments. So as we can see in the graph to the right, most projects for which we have data have paid out principal and a return, shown in green. And then in orange, we can see the number of projects which made some repayment. And then for those for which we have data, only 3 that didn't make any payment. So I'll wrap up with that. All of our research, which is like 15 reports, dozens of blog posts and recordings of events, as well as a monthly snapshot of the market, can be found on our website. Well, if you just Google Brookings and impact bonds, you will find that. I'll turn it back to you, Jemima. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Over to Mara next. So the Government Outcomes Lab has been really closely involved in the development and use of outcomes-based financing approaches in the UK. Mara, it would be fantastic to hear from you what we've learned from over 15 years of evidence of outcomes-based finance in the UK, and also how that could translate into different global contexts.
Thank you, Jemima, and thank you, Emily, for the background introduction. At the Go Lab, we are based at the School of Government. So on the next slide, just to give you a sense of the perspective I come from, we are looking at how government can effectively work with other actors in an ecosystem. So we have been studying social impact bond in the UK, but as an international school of government, we have a global outlook, and we've been gathering evidence, data, and we do a lot of engagement to try to understand from the perspective of government how these innovative instruments can support the achievement of a social outcome. On the next slide, I want to start with the very basic that these approaches, these innovative approaches, are interesting because of the focus on outcomes. And why that is interesting is that is measuring the outcomes at the end of the day is an attempt to capture quality. So when we look at government spending and procurement, often in practice, the focus is on cost, which is absolutely important. We want to make sure we don't waste the resources, but it's very difficult to capture quality. And so what is innovative in these approaches for government is an attempt to be better at measuring and monitoring this quality. And similarly, in development finance, often the focus, as Alejandro was saying, is on mobilization and disbursement, which is very important, but we also want to measure quality so that what is being mobilized, what is being disbursed is generating the greatest benefit. And so I think it's important to remind ourselves why the outcome is at the center, is to capture quality. And it's not just an innovative tool or a new toys to play with. At the essence is that we really want to create value and value for money. On the next slide, I want to say that there exists a lot of evidence out there. It's not well synthesized, and there are cases here and there, but at the Golan, we try to gather evidence to inform the UK government of what do we know to date. And this is part of a systematic review of the evidence that we did, and it stops in 2021. There are papers from the 90s, and those are papers that provide an empirical contribution. It might be qualitative, a case study, it might be quantitative, of using an outcome-based approach as opposed to a traditional one. So there is a comparator, and there is some evidence, but it's really hard to synthesize. There are some syntheses, but I just want to encourage everybody who is here to go back and look at the evidence. Our review stopped in 2020. As you can see, the number of papers is growing exponentially. So what we are missing are probably a lot of paper here. But there is a lot of insights from people that are in the room now that we need to build upon. On the next slide, this is, we maintain a data set of projects. We call them social outcome partnerships. And we have a data set at about 314. 1 in 3 are in the UK. So this is why we focus very much on the UK. 30% of this market, it started in the UK and is in the UK for the social impact bond and in particular. Last year, we published a report that was distilling 15 years of experience, particularly for the UK. And I'm going to share the key insight from that report. And then, as Jemima said, I will try to draw some links to the global landscape. So on the next slide, in terms of the key learnings, the questions I'm asked all the time is, do impact bonds work? You can't answer that question very meaningfully. And I appreciate why people want to know if impact bond works, but it's not clear compared to what. Is it compared to business as usual? Or is it compared to an ideal counterfactual of a perfect provision? And it's really, really difficult to identify what is a relevant comparator site to definitely say, do impact bond work universally? It's almost like asking, do grants work? Some grants work very well, other grants don't work very well. If you design them well, if you manage them well, they might work. If you design them poorly, they don't. And with impact bonds, it's about it's a similar issue. It depends. And so what I put in these slides are some of the insight of when impact bonds seem to be more appropriate and more likely to deliver outcomes. From the 15 years of the UK experience, what we learn is that when you need the intervention to be adaptable. So there is no one clear intervention with clear activities that you want to prescribe, but you need to enable some learning and course correction in order to achieve the outcome. And so you need to be very flexible and have the freedom of changing what is being done on the ground. In these situations, it seems that an impact bond or a social outcome partnerships might offer additional benefits compared to traditional ways of commissioning services. Similarly, is when you can really leverage the possibility of using data and performance. If you can define clear metrics and roles and use the data to really drive improvement. And in this accountability, it's really important to recognize that what we are trying to achieve is a change of behavior of individuals and organizations. We don't have the perfect levers to change the behavior. So the clarity of the metrics and the role and this active performance management is what helps to facilitate, induce this change in behavior. And finally, this approach, which is quite intense, seems to be particularly appropriate when you want to provide wraparound care, when you need to adapt a little bit the intervention around the need of the individual or the needs of a place, and you want to work with different agencies and you want them to coordinate. So by commissioning for a result that is a collective result, you can ask the different organizations to work together to achieve that. And you don't prescribe how they work together. You just say, this is the desired outcome. And so those three in the UK were the features of the context in which social outcome partnerships seem to really have an additional something to bring and to really make a difference to the outcomes of individuals. Much of it is echoed in some of the evidence on the development impact bonds. I picked, for instance, the work that the Chorus did for FCDO when they evaluated the pilots across different sites. And they also found that this way of working is particularly appropriate when you want to focus on improving performance. If what you're doing is good enough, stick to what you're doing. But if you want to enhance performance with this performance management approach, this might be something you want to look at. And also they need to maybe bring in some external disruptor. And I'm not sure if disruption is the right term, because also Chorus in their report point out how it is important that the external player provide expertise and support. We found that also in the UK, the role of the intermediaries, of people that mentor, coach, and support the provider sector organization is really fundamental. So on my next and last slide, I try to summarize some of the challenges and things that I look forward to study more going like in the years to come. And one is, as I said, there is a lot of evidence tucked away. And I think it's important that we build on that and extract some insights so that we learn from what others who came before us have done already. I think we are still not very good at answering the cost effectiveness of OBF. So we might find that in certain circumstances, it delivers value, but how much more resources are needed to do the performance management? Who bears those costs? And some of the criticism that we hear is that the provider organizations that often are quite small need to fill in a lot of form to feed upwards the real data in order to do the performance management. So that's something that we still really need to understand and improve upon. The role of the intermediaries, it comes across everywhere. That is fundamental. So maybe trying to identify what are the features of a good intermediary and how can we support those players to really make a difference on the ground. And then I have this idea of there are so many effective learnings. It doesn't mean that you need to do more impact bonds. It might be that some of the learnings that happen through an impact bonds are things that you want to keep, even in a different funding structure. But how do you institutionalize? How do you bring those practices in the day-to-day, in the routine of the organization is something that we need to improve upon. And finally, this is an area where I think practice is faster than research by a big measure. And so working closely with the community of practices and the work that the OECD is doing in bringing people together and trying to learn quickly and do some test and learn will be fundamental to stay ahead of the learning. I think that's it for me now. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Mara. And next we'll turn to Ozell. So we're going to get sector specific now. Ozell, how do you see the potential contributions that OBF can make in the education sector, contributions to achieving SDG 4 in low and middle income countries specifically? Tell us a bit about the evidence and experience that you've had working through the Education Outcomes Fund.
Thank you, Jemima, and thank you, Emily and Mara. I learn every time we're in a panel together. I learn so much from you, so really appreciate it. So for the next 7-8 minutes or so, as Jemima mentioned, I'll be speaking to outcomes-based financing for education and our learnings in this particular space. So I'll start by making a point that Emily also mentioned in her opening remarks on why we need OBF, and I'll hone in on SDG 4 goals around education. Those of you joining this side event who have been in the education space more than a decade, let's say, might remember what a milestone the SDGs were for education. It represented a major departure from the MDGs, where access to education was the sole priority. SDGs got us to think about, now that children are in school, are they actually learning? And the answer to this question was a painful realization that although governments have succeeded in getting children in school, most of the children were in fact not learning. So I think for many of us working towards the achievement of quality education for all, the 70% figure that was highlighted in one of Emily's slides, that 70% of 10-year-olds in low and middle income countries are not able to read and comprehend the basic text, that has been keeping us up at night, but it also has been motivating us to get up every morning and do the work that we do. We've been asking ourselves constantly, what else can we do to make sure that children are not only in school, but they're also learning the foundational skills that they need to thrive in school and also thrive in life as adults. So, and there is no doubt that over the past decade, there's been significant progress made to achieve some of the key SDG education goals. But there's also no doubt that we're still very far from achieving these goals. And this is exactly why putting more of our energies into realizing the promise of outcomes-based financing for education is so important. And unfortunately, the events of the last 3 weeks have added even more urgency to focus on aid effectiveness, something that Alejandro highlighted also. So I'd like to speak to a couple of the points that Emily and Mara discussed in their presentations. And you might remember from Emily's presentation looking at impact bonds in low and middle income countries by sector. And again, this was just impact bonds and not all types of outcomes-based financing. We saw that there are more impact bonds in education than the other sectors. And the question is, why is this the case? And I think there are 2 reasons. One of the drivers of the numbers we see in the use of OBF in education is the external organizations who have been championing its use. These are organizations who have built the partnerships necessary for OBF to take off and succeed. One of these organizations is my organization, Education Outcomes Fund. Another of these organizations is the British Asian Trust. And I think those of us in this sector are familiar with the amazing work that they've been leading in the education sector in India and Pakistan. I think the other reason why we see more impact bonds in education in low and middle income countries is because this is a sector where outcomes funds are being used more. And I'll speak to that in a minute. And in fact, I would say that we actually expect to see a significant increase in the number of OBF programs in education in the next couple of years. As EOF, for example, we're getting ready with our partners to launch 4 new outcomes with more than a dozen outcomes-based contracts in the next 12 months. So I personally think we're in fact at an inflection point for the use of OBF for education. And that is why it is so important to reflect on our learnings emerging from the first wave of OBF programs in education, so we make sure that we design and implement better in this next wave. And by doing so, we do a better job with realizing the promise that OBF offers for achieving SDG 4 goals. Mara and Emily already shared several learnings, and I'd like to focus on 2 additional learnings. The first one is we need to recognize that OBF programs are hard work. But Designing and implementing OBF programs are significantly easier where the ministries of education have in place assessment systems and strong systems for education information and data. So if resources are limited, and here I include patience among stakeholders as a resource. For the second wave, working in countries with stronger assessments and data systems might help with scale up. Now, with second learning, a lot of the discussion around how OBF delivers impact has focused on the role of performance management. Mara has already referred to it from the ECRIS report. So one thing that we have learned in the outcomes funds in Ghana and Sierra Leone, supported by FCDO, is that we had underestimated the value of the learning that happens among the organizations that are contracted under the same outcomes fund, the peer-to-peer learning. So in the second year of our programs, as a OF, we have invested a whole lot more of our time and resources to facilitate this peer-to-peer learning among the implementing organizations, recognizes that it speeds up adaptation, it speeds up innovation, and ultimately it holds tremendous value for improving children's learning outcomes. Now, on the next slide, I'd like to take 2 minutes to talk specifically about outcomes funds for education and the opportunity that it presents for learning about the factors that facilitate effective use of OBF. For those of you who might not be familiar with outcomes funds, they are an outcomes-based financing tool where you can pull funding from different sources and contract different implementing partners to achieve a set of pre-specified outcomes. So you can think about it as a tool that facilitates outcomes-based contracting at scale. I would argue that outcomes funds are a particularly powerful tool because they enable government stewardship. In the education outcomes funds that we've been involved in, the government is the driving force behind setting the objectives, the targets, and leads the other funders as well as the implementing partners. And I think this point about government stewardship is particularly important when we think about OBF's contribution to aid effectiveness. Outcomes funds is a tool that both focuses investments on learning outcomes, but it also makes sure that the government is in the driver's seat. All other funders contribute to achieving government's policy priorities, and these priorities are captured in the outcomes that the fund pays for. Now, putting my researcher hat on, I think the multiple outcomes fund that EOF is involved in is also providing us an amazing opportunity for comparative analysis to identify the factors that facilitate or inhibit the effective use of OBF. So in our early childhood education portfolio, for example, where 3 governments will be launching outcomes funds, we'll be able to compare across countries to examine how political economy matters. In each of these outcomes funds, we'll also have some beautiful variation in terms of the pre-financing arrangements and the program governance structures. So we'll be able to examine how these factors matter. And because EOF is involved in designing and implementing outcomes funds in different subsectors in education, we're also able to look at the enabling factors related to the structures of market provision and measurability of outcomes across early childhood education, primary education, and skills training programs. So starting next year with the conclusion of the 2 outcomes funds in Ghana and Sierra Leone, over a 5-year period, we're looking forward to producing with research partners a rich body of analysis and learning about OBF for education, which we hope will inform the second wave of the use of outcomes-based financing in education. Now, as a final word, I'd like to emphasize a point that Mara also made in her presentation. When we think about the learning priorities of OBF, I would argue that we need to pay much more attention to the systems and the ecosystems that the OBF programs operate in. But we also need to think about not only what we're trying to learn, but also how we're learning. And here I'd like to end my remarks by speaking to the importance and power of collective learning. By doing a better job with coming together as the OBF community to learn together, we can together move to a much steeper learning curve that will get us to more and better outcomes-based financing programs for education, but also for other sectors quicker. So let me stop here and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Ozal. An inspiring note to start the discussion on. So we're going to discuss amongst the panel for about the next half an hour, and then we're going to open up to the audience for questions. So if questions are being sparked as we go, do keep them in your head, and then be ready when we turn to the audience in about half an hour. I'd like to start by coming back to the link between OBF and FFD4. So Alejandro, you set out so clearly in your opening that while capital mobilization is going to be a key focus of FFD4, it's just as critical that we think about how to ensure effectiveness and impact. So my question to the panel is, what role can OBF play here? Emily, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I thought I had unmuted. So I think it's important to break this down into two pieces. One, we need more evidence on which interventions are the most cost effective. So part of the challenge is that we have scarce and very poor quality cost data, and even scarcer data on cost effectiveness. In fact, in a recent review of development interventions, only 1 in 5 had any evidence on value for money. And then the second piece that I was speaking to, and also Mara and Ozal spoke about, is what is the lever of the financing mechanism itself, right? And so we've talked about, we've highlighted the focus on effectiveness and the focus on achievement of outcomes. But what also such an important piece, and Ozal was sort of speaking about this at the end, is that it's really about system strengthening, right? It's about system strengthening and having more sustainable impact in the long run. I'll pause there and let my colleagues jump in as well.
Mara, Ozal, do you want to come in on this question? Otherwise, hold that thought on system strengthening. I'm going to ask about that next.
I'm happy to come in just to reinforce some of the things I think Emily already pointed out. Is and there's a way when we talk about aid effectiveness, that's a kind of a financing system that make sure that all actors are constantly thinking about and talking about and working towards outcomes. In and of itself is such a powerful force to get us to the outcomes that governments and those in the international community committed ourselves to under the SDGs, that I think we need to not underestimate that indirect effect as a way that this financing mechanism brings. So the other part is around something that I emphasize, especially with outcomes funds, like the multiplicity of actors in foreign aid is in a way one of the reasons why we're undermining its potential effectiveness. And by finding funding mechanisms like outcomes funds that puts the government in the driving seat, that makes sure that funding is pulled together from different sources to fund the outcomes that the government prioritizes, that in and of itself is very powerful as a contribution towards aid effectiveness. Now, in terms of the links between OBF and FFD4 agenda, I think our focus must remain on aid effectiveness, but we also need to recognize the tremendous value that OBF carries for the kind of partnerships that can be built with the private sector and the kind of the resources that can be brought in from the private sector. So there's also that indirect route through which because OBF facilitates more effective PPPs and is able to bring in impact investors and other private sources into the picture, is also quite a powerful, I think, contribution to the objectives that FFD4 is trying to pursue. But let me stop there because we'll talk more about system strengthening in a minute, I hear.
There is one thing that I want to add that I think is important on the FFD4 conversation, which is the localization agenda. The fact that you would like to foster an environment where there is local ownership and the outcome is delivered by local organization, listening to local people. And this is an instrument that has been used for place-based approaches. The UK is not a low-income country, but for instance, the outcome fund that we are currently finishing to evaluate had central government working with local government on a sort of match funding arrangement. And so there was this collaboration from an external funder, central government, as a parallel, and the councils, the particular town that knew their local community, the needs, the organization on the ground. So there is an opportunity to pivot the approach to support the localization agenda as well. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the potential there.
Yeah, Mara, you've taken the words out of my mouth, because one of the priorities that the UK is really interested in looking ahead to FFD4 is the importance of country ownership and the importance, Azal, to your point about the fragmentation of development finance, the importance of being able to align multiple sources of finance behind plans and objectives that are led by countries, whether those are national education strategies or national adaptation plans in the climate space. So, Mara, you've started us off down that path beautifully. Azal and Emily, what's your take on lessons that we've learned about how OBF can play a role in strengthening systems at the country level? Azal, you mentioned rightly that OBF is easier where there are strong systems, but are there examples of where OBF has been able to strengthen systems as it goes?
Emily, you've done a lot more thinking on this front across different countries and projects. I'm happy to speak to EOF's experience on this front. And we're at the beginning of the journey with two of our programs in Sierra Leone and Ghana, but also with several government partnerships that we have also in Rwanda and South Africa. First, I think several of you might have heard me say this before, but this is an area where, as a community, we need to think more. We need to work harder, and we need to be more intentional. I think this is a big learning area for the OBF community in terms of how do we start our engagements, our collaborations with systems at the core of all of our discussions and all of our design. So I think this is also an area that we've tried to capture in some of our collective learning initiatives with others in the community to learn from what might have worked. So there are ways in which, if we think about the systems not only as the government systems, but all the actors that are involved in the systems for education delivery, that the engagement in an outcomes fund, like in the case of the Sierra Leone Education Innovation Challenge, for example, we've seen the changes in the organizational decision-making processes of the grantees that are engaged in it. We're starting to see some of the changes in the type of the accountability relations that exist between service providers and the governments. And the governance structures that are put in place for running the outcomes funds play a big role in terms of how these accountability relations evolve over time. Now, this is far from putting systems at the center from the get-go. For example, a big learning for us has been with the program in Sierra Leone is what measurements do we select for the outcomes that we measure? Do we select the measures that are already in place for the government, or do we select measurement tools that could actually be adopted by the government going forward? Now that learning has now translated for our early childhood education portfolio into a much more intentional approach to how we select our measurement tools and how we make sure that they're already either part of government's quality assurance systems or they're developed in close consultation with the government, so it can be taken on by the government. So again, these are some of the softer and kind of harder parts of system strengthening. But to go back to the original point, I think this is an area as an organization that we're spending a whole lot more of our energies on to figure out, but also as a community of OBF practitioners, I think we see the need to think more about.
I think Ozell covered it incredibly well with experience of the EOF. Yeah, I mean, we've been observing this, like I said, for a long time across so many countries, and I think the learnings are different. I think in each context, we see some countries where specifically focused on low and middle income countries, where the government is taking a leading role, and there are other organizations around that. So in Colombia, for example, work around employment and skills impact bonds, and they've really used this as a way they've used the learnings and iterated and used these to develop future projects and outcome funds. And so I think that's a really good example. I think like at the end of the day, it's really, and Ozell just sort of said it, it's the aspects, there are so many elements to that system's strengthening, and part of it is that those partnerships and the interactions between all of these different stakeholders that are sort of in a way that are really facilitated by the financing mechanism. But all of these things, like what outcomes should we care about? How should we measure them? When should we measure them? What are the data that we need to go about this? And how much does it cost, right, to actually get those outcomes? So all of these are elements of that system strengthening, and I think Ozell made a really good point that it's an entire ecosystem of different actors, and that's on the government side and the private sector and non-state providers, et cetera. So
Yep. Let me take us on a slightly different tack for a moment. I'd like to talk a bit more about, Ozell, to use your words about how we learn and also how we use what we learn about OBF. So Mara, I'm going to come to you because I really liked your phrasing that practice is faster than research. So how do you think we can best strike a balance between generating really rigorous evidence on the one side and being pragmatic and getting things done on the other side, especially when many governments are facing budgetary pressures and also resourcing pressures that can make it harder to do both?
How much time do I have? It's a really challenging question. Like the experience at the GoLab is that we are, for our research and creating insight, there are different types of funding, and some are more like for academic research on longer time horizons, and that work on certain timelines and has incentive, and you generate insight. Maybe too late in the game for the practitioner to use, they need to have them now. And we receive funding from foundations or even government that wants to know today what works. And so it's really interesting, the tension between the two, and what you need to do is something in between. In our experience is that working, like curating a community of practice and working alongside them, and pick up some programs, maybe not all of them, but some of the programs lend themselves more easily to a good evaluation than others. So there is curating the conversation of the community on the qualitative insights, and then having enough research training to say, here there are the numbers, there is a good counterfactual, we can extract more insight from this particular project, and we can extrapolate the learning to others. And so to me, the community of practice that is a safe space to come and share is what is the starting point. And then having independent researcher as part of that conversation to opportunistically pick cases to do more in depth. When we recently did an evidence review on early childhood care and education and the use of OBF, and one of the things that I thought was quite surprising when we were summarizing the lessons learned came from reports written by independent researchers. And there is a lot of material that describes the particular projects, who is involved. But when it comes to the critical thinking, that critical voice of what was really learned, and that learning is put in the public domain, usually there is an independent researcher involved in that conversation. So to me, test, learn, share, but bring in the independent researcher that can have the credibility of extracting and extrapolating the results, and also be that critical friend that builds on your learning in a safe environment. It's much more difficult for an organization to go out with why this didn't quite work. Internally is politically difficult. So go to your local universities, the center of expertise that you count on, and bring them in. I'm sure they would love to help.
Thanks, Mara. And yeah, I mean, as FCDO, we've benefited so much from the partnership with the Go Lab in being that critical friend, and also helping us to realize where we're generating learning that perhaps because we're in the thick of delivery, we're not recognizing it or storing it in a useful way. So continuing on this theme, Azal, I'd like to come to you next. So as you mentioned, Education Outcomes Fund is at a really exciting stage where your first two programs in Sierra Leone and Ghana are approaching their conclusion, and you've got a great pipeline of future funds and future activities across several subsectors and regions. So how are you approaching translating some of the learnings and evidence that you've been gathering in your early programs to the very different contexts that you're looking to expand into next?
Thank you, Jemima. And as Mara, this is a topic that's very dear to my heart, so I could speak about it forever. But maybe before I talk about how we apply what we're learning to new programs, I think the learning itself is not automatic. And I think, Jemima, you already referred to this for FCDO, that doing is one thing, but doing it does not automatically translate to learning. Learning has to be intentional. It needs to be reflective. And it needs to benefit from critical friends coming in to help at times for it to be surfaced. So for our individual programs internally, we've been trying to put in certain practices around, for example, regular reflection sessions for our colleagues who work on program design and implementation. We've been trying to internally do monthly learning sessions. We've been trying to do retrospectives at critical points of the design process to learn, okay, what have we learned? What does this mean for the stage going forward? But there's a lot of learning that's also happening once the programs are being implemented. And I touched on this, the peer-to-peer learning that happens among the grantees, and us being able to not only facilitate that learning, but by engaging in an earnest exchange, also getting their feedback on how we can do better when we're managing the funds, and creating that kind of the collective spirit around where every day, if we talk with each other, if we share with each other, we'll all be doing better tomorrow. But obviously, we also bring in external independent researchers too. They're external evaluators for in the case of the ongoing program in Sierra Leone. There will be knowledge partners who will be selected and joining us for the programs in the early childhood care and education. And we have a separate program management evaluation focus also on that, like puts a spotlight on EOF. It's like, how well are we doing in managing these programs? Now, in terms of how we apply what we're learning in one program to the other, that's a tricky one because there's, I think, organizational learning challenges that apply to not just OBF, but all organizations apply. And I think, Mara, I remember you in a conversation we had a year ago, you talked about knowledge, the hard knowledge that's easy to codify and write down and then pass on. But then the soft knowledge that's very hard to kind of capture in writing and pass on. So when you have, for example, a program team working on one program, and then you start another one, the harder part of the knowledge is easier to pass on. It's been documented, it's been shared, you can talk about it. But the softer bit is the lessons, which kind of the grease that makes the wheels turn in any of the programs. That's the harder one to pass on from one program to the other. And for that, we try to make sure that, for example, colleagues are circulating across programs so they can carry that soft information across programs. And also, to the extent possible with working with external partners, we try to also tap into the hard and not soft knowledge acquired by other organizations. Because each context is unique. The fact that, you know, we've run a basic education program in Sierra Leone, how much applicability is that going to have to an early childhood education outcomes fund in South Africa? So we need to understand the limitations of what can be transferred and what needs to be relearned and rediscovered. And to speed that process up, we try to also look at learnings from other organizations that might have worked in similar contexts, more similar contexts on more similar programs than we have. But let me stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Azal. And that point about how much learning can be transferred and being able to see what is translatable and what isn't is definitely something we're really interested in as well as an outcomes funder. And as you say, the best answer is to have as wide a group, as wide a community of practice as possible and make sure that we're learning from all of the actors that are trying these approaches. Now, we've got, I think, just over 5 minutes left. So let me change tack again briefly. And Emily, I'd like to come to you on, I suppose, a slightly more technical question. Mara, at the beginning, presented her thoughts on the conditions in which OBF works best. So my question has two parts. Firstly, do you agree based on your research? And secondly, when do you think different types of OBF might be more appropriate depending on the conditions?
Sure, happy to jump in on that. So I think the first question is to always ask is if OBF is appropriate. And, you know, I mean, if outcomes are being achieved and efficiently or cost effectively, and by paying for inputs, then perhaps it makes sense to stick with traditional funding models. If not, then you might consider outcomes-based financing. And then there's a first big question, which is sort of which type of outcomes-based financing model do you use? You know, these depend on a couple of things. One is who is holding that financial risk. So is it the service provider? Is it the government, national government, or a subnational government? Or is it the investor in the case of an impact bond? And so that's one piece of it. Is that risk capital needed? And you can see in in the example of Education Outcomes Fund, and Roselle mentioned this in her in one of her slides, where they're looking at self-financing versus not self-financing. So are there differences in that? And then there's another aspect to it, which is that perhaps having those impact investors have the potential to bring some kind of expertise around performance management or pressure around performance management or the achievement of those outcomes. So those are sort of some big picture questions, and thinking about which form of outcomes-based financing might be more appropriate. Then there are some of the aspects that that are related to context that were mentioned both by Mara and by Roselle, that have to do with the capacity of the government, you know, our assessment system in place, our data systems in place, and then the availability and capacity of service providers in that context, may it be state or non-state service providers, and the capacity of them. And then there are other sort of environmental risk questions, geopolitical risk, et cetera, that also I think come into play. And then there's like this soft piece, I think, in a way that Roselle was mentioning, that also has to do with like willingness and sort of a champion, right? So in Sierra Leone, they had the huge benefit of having a really forward-thinking Minister of Education, David Senge, who was willing to, you know, to take a chance at looking at this type of financing model. So that's one aspect. When you get it down a little bit more micro, there are a couple things. I tend to use this kind of rule of thumb that I think is helpful, and Mara sort of alluded to it, which is that it makes the most sense if inputs are complex, but outcomes are simple to measure. And so this is partly why we see so many in the employment sector, for example. And then the other aspect that's related to that Mara also raises this issue around kind of person-centered provision, where there's particularly benefit because that person-centered provision can be complex. And so there's really potential value add of the flexibility and adaptation. Where I would say that it is perhaps more challenging. So one thing that we've seen is that it can take a longer time to get this off the ground, because all of these sort of systems pieces related to measurement and the coordination of these different actors take time. So maybe not appropriate for like a humanitarian crisis that needs to like a quick response to humanitarian crisis. Anyway, there are other aspects related to time as well, and sort of who's there, the right people at the right time in a given context.
Superb, thank you, Emily. And I think your answer really underlines for me just how much has been learned about these approaches and practically how we can use them and how we can best use them and the role they play in the broader toolkit that we all have at our disposal. So I'd like to end with a question that brings us back to FFD4, and it's a quick one. So I'd love to hear from Mara, Roselle, and Emily on this one. How would you like to see OBF reflected in the commitments that are going to be made at FFD4 in Seville later this year?
Happy to have a start. To me, is I would like to see the commitments be expressed in terms of the outcome that this new financing commitments might achieve. My fear is that these commitments will be a commitment on how much resources will be deployed, but we need to go beyond that and really think what is the difference we want to make. Maybe linking to the SDGs. There are lots of tools out there, but taking like sticking your neck out there and say, this is the difference we think this new phase will make in terms of outcomes.
I'm happy to go next. I think similar to what Mara is saying, I think we need to see a commitment to both outcomes and to partnerships. And I feel like outcomes-based financing is right at the intersection of this, is being able to bring partnerships across government departments, with private sector, with non-state actors, and focusing all on the outcomes that we need to achieve the SDGs. So in a way, shifting the focus, maybe not shifting the focus, but adding the additional focus to the more financing and saying, to get there, we need better partnerships, and we need these partnerships to focus on outcomes, and outcomes-based financing in that way is a tool, is a financing mechanism that we need more ownership from the governments, from the private sector, and from the non-state actors.
And I'll just add to that, which is that to be able to engage in these partnerships, or these partnerships for public purpose, as we put forth in a blog post together with Amel Kabul, who's the CEO of the OF. There's really a need for data, and so to be able to do this, you need to know how much it costs to deliver these programs, to deliver the outcomes in these programs. You need to be able to measure the outcomes, et cetera. So seriously committing to making data collection, analysis, and use a priority, I think also should be a really important part of the conversation.
Fantastic, thank you. I'll pass to Steph now, who's going to moderate the Q&A. Steph, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Jemima. See a lot of friends here, but for those who don't know me, my name is Stephanie Ridenauer, and I'm Associate Director with LAVOCA and part of the Outcomes Finance Alliance Secretariat. So this has been a great conversation so far. We'll open it up now for about the next 10 minutes or so. I've already seen a couple questions come in the chat, but feel free to raise your hand or also add additional questions in the chat. And you can direct them towards any of us, towards the panelists or Alejandro. But yeah, so why don't we start off with, I saw a question from Nevelyn in the chat about cost effectiveness. Nevelyn, did you want to come in and ask your question? You're still on?
Hi, everybody. Thanks to the speakers. I think I hear lots of questions about asking whether outcomes-based financing is cost effective. But when we look at what government is already doing in terms of their programs, they don't know what the cost, those programs are not necessarily cost effective. They don't know whether they're getting value for money. So I wonder why there's this, I mean, I understand the focus on that, but we seem to forget that actually what government is currently doing is not looking at value for money. And so we must say, that must be part of the conversation, in that we actually are bringing in a system where you do start to look at value for money, even if it's not perfect where we are at the moment. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Anyone in particular want to take this question? We've already discussed cost effectiveness a little bit today.
I can have some, because there are two ways of thinking of cost effectiveness in this case. One is the program I funded cost effective? And it is true that there is an immense scrutiny on the OBF approaches, in part because the data is more available, because it's required by the system to measure the outcome. So you can say, oh, let's measure the cost effectiveness and then the issue with cost. But Nevelyn, you're right. There is so much attention on the cost effectiveness of intervention funded with OBF compared to the business as usual government grant that is not there. But the point I was making of cost effectiveness was at a higher level of I can fund an intervention with a traditional contract. Maybe let's suppose that the intervention is cost effective. I know there is evidence that this intervention will make a big difference, and under normal provision, it makes it should lead to cost effective results. But when I implement it with a grant, I don't quite get the outcomes. It might be delivered in a very agile way, but I don't see results in school. I don't see people in jobs. I don't see people in stable accommodation. If I go to an OBF, I put in a lot of the active performance management, the energy, and maybe I see this outcome, but there was also a lot of resources put in. And one of the cost effectiveness question is the additional resource put in to actively manage the relationship, the contract, collecting the data, assessing the data, auditing it, worth the additional benefits? And that is the one that is difficult. But I take your point, the level of scrutiny under which my experience with the UK government, these approaches are put under has nothing to do with the business as usual. Lots of funding has no regular evaluation, and we don't know if they're value for money. So it seems that there is a little bit like two measures here, and point taken. But the key question on the cost effectiveness that I wanted to make was, is the additional effort of this way of working worth the additional benefits? And I think the jury there is still out because it's difficult to assess.
Can I come in at this, Neveline's question with a different perspective? So
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't have a technical background in cost effectiveness analysis, but my understanding is by definition, it's a comparative exercise. So by looking at something in and of itself, you can't just say, is this is cost effective or not? You can only look at its cost effectiveness compared to other programs. Now, what we're having difficulty at EOF is that comparison. Who do we compare it to? And it's not just I think a kind of an issue that was raised before. Do we compare it to a traditional grant versus like a well-managed grant? The problem is, do we have the right impact data? And do we have the good quality cost data, and Emily can speak to this, to be able to do a fair comparison? And so far our answer is probably not. So not only we have to prove that there's cost effectiveness, but we're not able to find the right comparison group with the good data to be able to make that comparison. So we're left in this limbo of how do we tackle this wicked, research question.
I always love it when somebody else is waving the flag that I'm usually waving. Thanks, Elsa. You've been hanging out with me too much. Yeah, I mean, indeed, that's the issue, is that for many types of interventions, we don't have good quality cost data or good quality evaluation data, and much less the combination of the two. I think also the point that Mara was making is that sort of, and I've made also, is that that's one piece. And then there's another piece, is the financing mechanism and sort of the efficiency of the financing mechanism. And again, on this, we need more data on what does it cost to deliver these outcomes. But I would also argue that cost, what should be considered is that the cost of doing outcomes-based financing, for example, also potentially leads to a number of other benefits, which we talked about today, which is the system strengthening aspect. So it may not just be benefiting the cohort of young children that are part of this project, but it could benefit many cohorts to come, because the systems have been strengthened through these investments. So I think it's also important to talk about investments versus just cost, right?
Yeah, excellent point. And I'm seeing a great discussion in the chat as well. And I think your remarks actually just also answered a very good kind of observation and question from Hilda, really about what's the, how can you really look at the added value of the outcome financing itself? And I think you've all touched on that very well. So let me look back to a question that was in the chat from Selena, and then I'll go to Royston, who I see has has his hand raised. So Selena has a good question from an NGO perspective. What are the key steps for NGOs to access impact funds in a crowded development landscape? And would partnerships be largely done with governments or other IFIs? So I think we've had a lot of discussion today around service providers and how these approaches can help them enter the market, like Emily had noted, or benefit from peer-to-peer learning, like Ozell had noted. So for any of the panelists that want to take this, for an NGO, perspective, how do they begin to get engaged in these types of approaches? What's the starting point? Do you need to have a government or kind of donor, sponsor as an outcome funder in driving the conversation?
Stephanie, maybe you can jump in about the Outcomes Accelerator.
I'm happy to have one of our panelists take it. And happy to give a plug for Outcomes Accelerator too, but maybe we hear from you guys first.
I'll jump in first, just with a general point, Selena, and that's that we really are trying to think about outcomes-based financing as a practice that any organization can internalize in some way, rather than a sort of a marketplace of these mythical outcomes funders and that you have to break into. So I think, and that there are great resources out there, not least those produced by the Go Lab, by Brookings and by EOF, that can perhaps help any organization to start to think about how you can drive more outcomes focus internally, and then find those stakeholders and those funders that are willing to work in a more outcomes focused way. But let me stop there. Azal, I think you were going to come in on this one as well.
I mean, just two quick comments, and 100% agree with Jemima. I think it's important that while we understand the various tools that fall under outcomes-based financing, ultimately this is an approach. It's an outcomes-based approach, and organizations go through this journey using different tools. And it doesn't require necessarily an impact investor. It doesn't necessarily require government. So for those who are interested in the particular impact bond model, I mean, there's a number of impact investors, and I think OFA members include some of them. There's a number of philanthropic organizations that are actually now using philanthropic funds, both for outcomes-based oriented financing. So those could be kind of partnerships that an NGO could be looking for. If for outcomes funds and the outcomes funds that we facilitate, for example, we do competitive selection processes through regular call for proposals or request for proposals that are announced, because we are a UNICEF hosted fund through the UNICEF channel and do our selections that way. And a lot of NGOs who are our implementing partners join the outcomes funds through this competitive selection process. But let me stop there. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you all. And I will just, since Emily opened the door for me, I'll just give a short plug for the Outcomes Accelerator, which it's an initiative of the Outcomes Finance Alliance. And part of the objective is to try to help develop the OBF market and support organizations, including service providers and NGOs, go on that learning journey with OBF. So seed funding is something that the Outcomes Accelerator provides on a competitive basis to do that. Okay, I know we're almost near time, but let's go ahead and hear from Royston, maybe as the last question that we can take before we wrap up.
Thanks,
Royston.
Stephanie. Hi, thanks, Stephanie. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, probably the only one braving the closing midnight hour in India, but I'm just sort of fresh from the OECD conversation in Paris for the private finance conversation seemed to be all around mobilization. I'm just trying to see whether there is a way we can build a more compelling story that links OBF to mobilization, because we are going to struggle to find new pools of capital to fill a $4 trillion gap. We are seeing some of the global headwinds, and I don't know whether people have called that out specifically. I haven't heard that. But those are going to impact a lot of the guarantee, is going to impact a lot of the other key pieces in blended finance models. So is there a way to use OBF to attract new pools of capital from an Asian perspective, Japan, Korea, Asia Pacific, Australia, pension funds, Middle East? Those are pools of capital that could probably step in to fill in the gap of the global north. Is someone specifically looking at that? And could OBF be that foot in the door product that would be able to bring those pools of capital in? And shout out to Andrea for a great OECD conference.
Great, fantastic question, Royston, to close on. I know we're at time, and I think Zach was going to wrap us up. So Zach, maybe if you don't mind, I'll kind of kick it over to you for maybe your thoughts to opine a little bit on that question, and then close us out.
Sure, and I'll try to wrap it into some of my closing remarks. And I think in short, Royston, I think I agree. And this is it's not just a conversation about the quality of spending, but how do you both make the existing resources better quality, but also use that quality conversation to make and mobilize new money more effective. And I think there's an opportunity here to bridge those two. I think just a few concluding remarks. One, I'd like to thank our panelists and moderators from Oxford, Brookings, FCDO, OECD, and the Education Outcomes Fund. As the Outcomes of Finance Alliance, we'll be continuing to engage the FFD4 process with our goal of ensuring that OBF is reflected in the Financing for Development outcome document. And I think, Royston's is an opportunity also to think about how do we ensure OBF is reflected in both the development effectiveness part of that, but also the mobilization of blended finance part of that outcome document. Also, just as a quick plug, we'll also be continuing these conversations beyond FFD4 in late April in Cali, Colombia at the annual Outcomes Finance Alliance Summit. And I encourage all of you who are here today to register and join us in person to really deepen some of these conversations. And so as we conclude, I just want to make a few just quick summary thoughts and remarks. And look, I know the topic of efficiency and effectiveness of public sector spending particularly has been dominating the headlines recently, and both here in the United States, but also in many countries. And putting aside whatever different politics or opinions we may have, I think this is a conversation that we've been, all of us, talking about, which is efficiency for quite some time. And if we think about tools like outcomes-based finance that prioritize measurement, results, shifting resources away from ineffective investments towards more effective programs, whether you're a developed or developing country, it makes a lot of sense in my opinion. And so just kind of taking away from some of this conversation today, I think my first takeaway is that OBF definitely aligns to FFD4's priorities on effectiveness, accountability, country ownership, and international development cooperation. It's a tool that in some cases can help bridge both public and private sector investments, and thinking of the private sector not just as investors, but also as a source of innovation and know-how, where we're already seeing large companies and social enterprises engage in this instrument. And the WEF put out a very recent, great report about this. It also helps strengthen systems at the country level as well as the local level. It can help ensure financing is more efficient, transparent, impactful, as well as mutually accountable. My second takeaway is that there's definitely going to be continued importance, particularly if OBF continues to be a part of this international development cooperation architecture, on continued research, data sharing, and collective learning around OBF, and to really strengthen the case in policy discussions. I think my final takeaway is that I think there's still a lot of opportunity to deepen our research beyond thinking of OBF just as impact bonds, but really looking at the broader suite of outcomes-based instruments being used by governments, by larger investors, where it's not just where it's perhaps a step down in interest rates, and really to expand that dialogue. So thank you again to everyone for joining. This is a very enriching panel. I have lots of notes here, and I always learn from all of you, and so really appreciate that. Thank you again, Alejandro, Jemima, Emily, Mara, Ozel. As well as a special thanks to my Lavoca colleagues, Steph and Noreen, who helped organize this session.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.